On the cold evening of January 5th, 1757, the Palace of Versailles shimmered in candlelight. The gilded halls and marble staircases glowed with opulence, a temple to France's divine monarchy. Courtiers in powdered wigs whispered, flirted, and schemed, their silk shoes clicking across polished floors. At the center of it all, King Louis XV, the beloved, moved through his palace with the easy assurance of a man whose body was more than flesh. To his subjects, his very skin was sacred, for the king was not merely a ruler. He was the living embodiment of the state, of France itself. But as Louis stepped from his carriage that night, amid courtiers and guards, a figure slipped from the shadows. He was not noble. He wore no jewels. His clothes were rough, his face unremarkable. His name was Robert-François Damiens, and in his hand was a small penknife. The blade flashed. In a swift motion, Damiens thrust the knife into the king's chest. Gasps tore through the courtyard. Guards lunged forward, wrestling the attacker to the ground. Louis staggered, clutching his side. Blood stained his vest, but the wound was shallow, more a prick than a mortal strike. The king lived. In truth, the knife had barely pierced his flesh, but the deed itself was monstrous. The king's body, however lightly wounded, had been violated. To stab Louis was not just to harm a man. It was to strike in the very heart of France, to assault the sacred vessel chosen by God. That the weapon was a mere penknife mattered little. In the eyes of court and clergy alike, Damiens had committed the most terrible crime imaginable, lèse-majesté, an attack on the majesty of the king. The guards dragged Damiens into custody. He cried out, protesting that he meant no treason, that he wished only to warn Louis of the dangers posed by corrupt clergy and dangerous policies. But his words drowned beneath the roar of outrage. Courtiers screamed for his death. Servants crossed themselves in terror. Louis, pale but composed, reassured his entourage. "Do not be afraid, gentlemen. It is nothing," yet even he knew that this was nothing. Within hours, Paris buzzed with rumor. Who was this man? A lone fanatic? A pawn of Jesuits, Jansenists, or foreign conspirators? In the cafes, whispers swelled. Had Spain or England bribed him? Was the clergy behind it? The attack revealed not only the vulnerability of the king's body, but also the paranoia of a kingdom riddled with intrigue. Robert-François Damiens was no grand conspirator. He was a failed servant, dismissed from posts, burdened by debts, his mind restless and embittered. Some called him unbalanced, others simply desperate. He claimed to have acted alone, and the truth suggests he did. Yet his mediocrity mattered little. The monarchy could not afford to treat this as the act of a mere malcontent. To preserve its aura, the crown needed to make an example. And so, from the moment the knife grazed Louis's chest, Damiens' fate was sealed. He was taken in chains to Paris, thrust into the dungeons of the Conciergerie. His interrogators wasted no time. He was shackled, bound, and pressed with questions he could not answer. Who sent him? Who aided him? Did foreign powers guide his hand? He swore he acted alone, but his captors demanded more. To stab the king was to defy the natural order. How could one obscure man dare such a deed without accomplices? The Parliament of Paris and the King's Council debated his punishment. There could be no question of leniency. By law, the penalty for attempted regicide was fixed. The ancient ritual of drawing and quartering, the most gruesome death reserved for traitors and assassins. The sentence would not merely kill Damiens, it would erase him. body, memory, even ash scattered so that no trace of his existence remained. News of the punishment swept across France. Crowds murmured in awe and horror. It had been generations since Paris had seen a man condemned to this archaic fate. Some relished the coming spectacle, anticipating the theater of cruelty. Others recoiled, dreading what they would be forced to witness. But all agreed this would be no ordinary execution. For Louis, the knife wound healed quickly, but the scar it left upon his monarchy ran deep. The court insisted that to restore the sacred aura of kingship, Damiens must be destroyed in a way so complete, so horrifying, that no one would ever dare lift a hand against the crown again. His body would be torn by pincers, scalded with boiling oil, and finally ripped apart by horses, a ritual of annihilation centuries old, staged in the heart of Paris. Thus began the final chapter of Robert-François Damiens' life, a story that would end not with a simple death, but with hours of agony upon the cobblestones of the Place de Grève, before the eyes of thousands. A penknife had drawn a drop of royal blood. For that, France would demand rivers of his own. Robert-François Damiens was dragged from Versailles in chains, bound so tightly that the iron bit into his skin. His face was bruised from the beatings delivered by guards and enraged courtiers who had nearly torn him apart in their fury. It was a miracle he even reached Paris alive, for many cried that he should be torn to pieces on the spot. But a monarchy wanted more than revenge. They wanted a ritual. They wanted theater. And for that, he needed to endure. The Conciergerie, the fortress prison on the Ile de la Cité, loomed as his final dwelling place. Its thick stone walls had held countless prisoners, but none so infamous in living memory as this failed servant who had dared touch the sacred body of the king. He was thrown into a dark cell, chained to the floor, watched day and night. Guards were instructed never to speak to him, never to let him out of their sight. His body was treated not as flesh, but as evidence, the proof of a crime so heinous it shook the kingdom. Yet even as he languished in chains, his interrogators demanded answers. Could he really have acted alone? France buzzed with paranoia. The Jesuits, long embroiled in disputes with the crown, were suspected. So too were the Jansenists, accused of breeding sedition. Some whispered of English gold, Spanish plots, or secret nobles conspiring to bring down Louis XV. Damiens, bewildered and broken, swore again and again that he had no accomplices, that his act was his own. He was no assassin in the pay of foreign powers, only a disgruntled man with a knife. But such a confession satisfied no one. The crime was too immense. Surely someone else had whispered in his ear, guided his hand. His silence, or rather his insistence on solitude, only provoked harsher measures. The torture began. Damiens was bound tightly with ropes until his circulation nearly stopped. He was forced into the dreaded boot, a device in which wedges were hammered between boards bound around his legs, crushing flesh and bone until marrow oozed. The screams echoed down the prison corridors, chilling even hardened jailers. Then came the red-hot pincers, clamping into his skin, tearing strips of flesh from his arms and chest. The wounds were not meant to kill him, only to break him, to loosen his tongue. After each agony, he was asked again, "Who helped you? Who ordered this?" His replies never changed. "No one. I acted alone." Still unconvinced, his captors resorted to the most grotesque of torments. Molten sulfur and lead were dripped into his wounds. Boiling oil was poured onto raw flesh. Each drop seared him, filling his cell with the smell of scorched skin. The pain was unimaginable, but the answers remained the same. If there was a conspiracy, Damiens either truly knew nothing of it, or he chose to die with the secret locked in his mouth. Word of his tortures spread through Paris. Some spoke of pity, others of grim satisfaction. Ordinary people whispered of the man who had dared to touch the king, marveling that he was still alive after such punishments. Crowds gathered outside the conciergerie, hoping to glimpse him through barred windows, to see the monster who had struck at France itself. For the monarchy, however, the torture was as symbolic as it was practical. The body of Damiens had become a stage. Each wound, each scream was part of a performance of power. If the king's body was sacred, then the body of the man who had violated it must be desecrated, unmade, until it ceased to be human. Even as he suffered, the machinery of justice turned. The Parliament of Paris formally condemned him. His sentence was announced with chilling precision. He would be drawn and quartered in the Place de Grève, the ancient square of executions. Before the horses tore him apart, he would endure further ritual agonies. His flesh would be ripped with glowing pincers. His wounds would be bathed with molten lead, boiling oil, resin, and burning sulfur. Only then, after hours of torment, would his body be dismembered and burned to ashes, scattered to the wind. This was no ordinary sentence. It was the ultimate penalty, reserved for the ultimate crime, regicide. France had not seen such a punishment in generations. The sheer brutality of the decree shocked even some of those who heard it read aloud. But none dared object. To attack the king was to attack the state, and the state would respond with annihilation. In his cell, chained and scarred, Damiens heard the news with dull resignation. He had no illusions left. Death awaited him, but not swiftly, not mercifully. He would not be granted the clean blade of the axe or the rope of the gallows. His death would be a slow unmaking, a performance for tens of thousands, a theater of agony designed to terrify all who witnessed it. For weeks he waited in the conciergerie. His wounds festered. His mind wandered. Guards whispered that he sometimes prayed, sometimes muttered incoherently, sometimes sat in silence, staring at nothing. On the morning of March 28, 1757, Paris awoke with a strange fever in its veins. Word had spread for weeks that François Damiens, the would-be regicide, would be executed that day in the Place de Grève. For many, it was an event of biblical proportions, a ritual to cleanse the stain left on the king's body. For others, it was morbid curiosity that drew them from their homes into the cold spring air. By dawn, tens of thousands were already pressing into the square. The Place de Grève had seen countless executions, but nothing on this scale. A massive scaffold had been erected, dominating the open ground. At its center stood a stout wooden platform where Damiens would be displayed. Around it were set cauldrons, their contents already simmering, molten lead, boiling oil, burning resin, and sulfur. To one side stood the wooden hurdles upon which the condemned would be bound, dragged through the streets before arriving here. To another, 4 strong horses stamped and snorted, their handlers adjusting the thick ropes that would soon be tied to Damiens' limbs. The square became a theater. Nobles leaned from windows draped with tapestries, ensuring they had the best view. Merchants and laborers crowded shoulder to shoulder, climbing onto carts and rooftops for a better vantage point. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders, wide-eyed with anticipation, Some clutched pastries sold by hawkers who prowled the crowd, as though this were a festival rather than a ritual of death. At the edge of the crowd stood lines of soldiers, their muskets gleaming, keeping order among the masses. France's elite, judges, magistrates, and officials of the Parlement of Paris assembled in their robes, ready to witness the spectacle of justice carried out in the king's name. At last, the distant tolling of bells announced the procession. A murmur swept the square, rising to a roar as the condemned appeared. Damiens was dragged on a hurdle, face up, his body broken from weeks of torture. His flesh bore the scars of pincers and burns, his eyes hollow, his hair matted with sweat. He was dressed only in a filthy linen shirt, his limbs bound with ropes that cut into his skin. The horses strained, pulling the hurdle across the cobblestones. Stones and dung scraped his back raw as the crowd jeered, spat, and hurled insults. Some shouted regicide. Others crossed themselves, fearful of witnessing such a crime in its punishment. Through the din, Damiens mumbled prayers. His lips moved ceaselessly, whispering appeals to God, to Christ, to the Virgin Mary. Yet his voice was drowned by the crowd's roar. When the procession reached the scaffold, the executioners hauled him up, binding him tightly to a wooden frame at the center. The instruments of agony gleamed in the morning sun. Red-hot pincers, long and cruel, lay on iron plates. The cauldrons bubbled, steam rising in thick clouds. Buckets of boiling liquid were prepared, ready to be poured into open wounds. Before the torments began, a priest leaned close, offering final prayers. Witnesses claimed Damiens begged forgiveness from God, insisting once more that he had acted alone, that no one else's hands had guided his knife. His words were barely finished before the first cries erupted. The pincers bit into his chest and thighs. Chunks of flesh tore away, glistening red. Damiens screamed, his voice carrying over the square, a sound so raw it silenced even the loudest jeers for a moment. The executioners moved methodically, tearing at his arms, his legs, his torso. Each wound was then bathed in molten lead and burning oil, the liquid hissing as it seared his flesh. The smell of scorched skin drifted over the crowd, mingling with the smoke. Some spectators gagged. Others leaned closer, morbidly fascinated. This was more than punishment. It was liturgy. Every step was prescribed by law, centuries old, designed not just to step was prescribed by law, centuries old, designed not just to destroy but to sanctify the king's power. Damiens' agony was France's absolution. His body was the altar upon which the crime of regicide was expiated. And yet, even among the crowd, unease grew. Children cried, women fainted, hardened men turned pale. What had been anticipated as a spectacle began to feel like horror. Chroniclers would later record that even seasoned executioners hesitated, unnerved by the sheer cruelty of the task. But the ritual had only begun. When the tortures with pincers and boiling substances were completed, the executioners prepared for the finale. Ropes were brought forth, thick and coarse, tied tightly to Damiens' wrists and ankles. The four horses were led closer, their muscles taut, their hooves striking sparks from the stones. The crowd surged forward, straining to see. This was the moment all had come to witness. The tearing apart of a man, limb from limb, in the name of the king. Damiens, barely conscious, lifted his head weakly. His lips moved in prayer. His body trembled with every breath. The square held its breath. Robert François Damiens lay bound to the scaffold, his arms and legs tied with thick ropes that led to 4 restless horses. Their breath steamed in the cold air, their flanks quivering, nostrils wide as the handlers tightened the harnesses. Around them, the crowd pressed forward, craning necks and climbing onto ledges to see the spectacle promised in proclamations. The moment had arrived, the tearing of a man limb from limb. The chief executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, raised his arm. The signal was given. The handlers cracked their whips. The horses leapt forward. The ropes pulled taut. Damien's body convulsed violently as his arms were yanked to the sides and his legs downward. He shrieked, not the sharp cry of pain he had given under pincers, but a long, ragged scream that seemed to tear from the very bottom of his lungs. The sound rolled across the square, chilling even those who had come eager for vengeance. But the horses alone could not finish the work. They strained, hooves scraping against the cobblestones, muscles bunching, but Damien's body resisted. His joints stretched, his skin tore, but his limbs did not separate. The man's tendons and sinews, those invisible ropes of nature, proved stronger than the ropes of hemp. The crowd groaned with frustration, some shouting for the horses to pull harder. The executioners had expected this. They drew knives. With clinical precision, they slashed into the prisoner's joints, hacking at the shoulders, the thighs, the groin, cutting the sinews that bound flesh to bone. Blood spurted, soaking the scaffold. Damiens writhed, his cries now hoarse and broken. The horses were urged on again. They surged forward with renewed force. This time the ropes dug deeper, the cuts widened, and the tearing began. His right arm gave way first, snapping from the shoulder in a spray of blood and tissue. The crowd erupted with gasps and shouts. Some recoiled, others cheered, a grim chorus to the horror unfolding. Then the left arm, dragged slowly, skin splitting, bone cracking, until it too tore free. The executioners lifted the severed limbs high, displaying them to the masses before casting them aside. Still Damiens lived. Still he screamed. The horses strained at his legs, their muscles trembling with exertion. But once again, the flesh resisted. More cutting was needed. The executioners hacked at his thighs, slicing until the ropes could finish what steel began. At last, his right leg ripped loose, dangling grotesquely before being tossed aside. The left followed soon after. By now, Damiens was no longer a man, but a ruin of blood and torn flesh, his torso twitching, his head rolling weakly against the wooden block. Yet witnesses swore his eyes still moved, that his mouth still formed prayers. Whether he truly clung to life, or whether it was only the spasms of a body destroyed, none could say. The executioners, their aprons soaked red, moved to complete their task. They severed what remained of his shattered body, gathering the limbs together. The pieces were cast into a great fire prepared at the edge of the square. His torso, still faintly quivering, was heaved onto the flames. The smoke billowed, carrying with it the stench of burning flesh that drifted over the crowd. And still the ritual was not finished. The ashes were raked apart, stirred with iron rods until no bone or fragment remained. What little was left was scooped into sacks and carried away to be scattered to the winds, ensuring that no trace of Robert François Damiens, no relic for future rebels, would endure. The entire ordeal had lasted hours. From the first tearing with pincers to the final scattering of ash, the execution consumed the day. Witnesses later confessed to nightmares, unable to shake the memory of Damiens' screams, of the stubborn resilience of his body, of the grotesque labor required to unmake him. Even the officials, hardened by years of trials and sentences, seemed shaken. Some recorded their disgust in diaries. Foreign ambassadors, watching from privileged seats, wrote letters to their sovereigns describing the execution in lurid detail. They agreed on one thing. Never had Paris witnessed such a spectacle, such a deliberate display of cruelty sanctified as justice. The crowd dispersed slowly, shaken and silent. Where in the morning there had been jeers and excitement, now there was only an uneasy quiet. Men led their children home quickly, women crossed themselves, and even the most hardened laborers muttered prayers under their breath. The ritual had achieved its purpose, terror. But beneath the terror lay something else, a seed of revulsion. For while the monarchy had meant to assert its inviolable power, the people had seen the state's violence laid bare. They had seen the sacred body of the king avenged not with majesty, but with butchery. When the ashes of François Damiens were scattered to the wind on March 28, 1757, the authorities thought they had wiped him from the world. No grave, no relics, no memory, a man erased. But the very excess of his punishment ensured the opposite. Instead of vanishing, Damiens became unforgettable, not as a martyr to a cause, but as the victim of a monarchy that revealed its cruelty in the public square. Across Paris, the memory of that day spread like wildfire. Chroniclers describe the endless torments, the pincers tearing flesh, the boiling lead, the horses straining for hours to tear apart a body that seemed cursed to cling to life. Some spectators wrote with pride that justice had been done. Yet many more confessed horror, nausea, even shame at what they had witnessed. Ordinary Parisians who had expected theater returned home shaken. They had seen not majesty but monstrosity. Foreign ambassadors carried the tale across Europe. Letters from Venice to London to Vienna repeated the lurid details. How the executioners hacked into Damiens's joints when the horses failed. How his limbs were torn off one by one. How his torso twitched even as it was cast into the fire. The descriptions were so vivid that they became infamous, copied into pamphlets, whispered in salons, and retold around dinner tables. The execution of François Damiens was not forgotten. It became a legend and a stain. The monarchy had hoped to reinforce its divine power. Instead, it had exposed the fragility of its image. For if a king's authority required such grotesque cruelty to defend, then what did that say of his legitimacy? Enlightenment thinkers seized on the event as proof of barbarism disguised as justice. Voltaire, already a critic of absolute monarchy, made sly reference to the atrocity in his letters, hinting at the savagery of kings who cloaked themselves in divine right. Denis Diderot, editor of the Encyclopédie, saw in it the rotting heart of a justice system that preferred spectacle to humanity. A few decades later, Michel Foucault would open his Discipline and Punish with the chilling details of Damiens's fate, contrasting it with the clinical efficiency of modern prisons. For philosophers, his screams became a text, a symbol of how power writes itself upon the body. But for the French people, the memory endured in simpler, darker ways. Parents invoked it as a warning, whispering to unruly children that this was what happened to those who raised a hand against the king. Soldiers recalled the stench of burning flesh, the sight of Damiens's stubborn body refusing to break, and shuddered. Some said Paris itself had been haunted by the cries, echoing through alleys at night. The monarchy, sensing the revulsion it had provoked, quietly let the ritual die with Damiens. Never again in France would a man be drawn and quartered. Later executions, even of traitors, would be swifter, less theatrical. In a sense, Damiens was the last victim of medieval justice, sacrificed on the altar of a monarchy already tottering under the weight of its contradictions. And yet his name lingered as a dark joke. In taverns, doing a Damiens became slang for violent death. Satirists hinted at him when mocking Louis XV's waning popularity. His execution became shorthand for excess, invoked whenever royal justice seemed too cruel, too archaic. When the revolution came 3 decades later, the image of Damiens resurfaced. Revolutionaries remembered the monarchy's brutality and pointed to his fate as proof that kings cloak themselves in sanctity only to unleash horror when defied. The guillotine, swift and mechanical, was born partly from this revulsion, a promise that executions would be efficient, equal, and stripped of sadistic ritual. Ironically, Damiens' ordeal helped inspire a method meant to be humane, even as it too would claim thousands of lives. François Damiens left no movement behind him, no faction, no cause. He was no hero, no martyr in the traditional sense. His act, the prick of a penknife against a king's chest, was clumsy, desperate, and futile. Yet the state's overreaction transformed him into something greater, a symbol of the cruelty that absolute monarchy inflicted to preserve itself. His knife had barely drawn blood, but his death drowned France in the memory of agony. Centuries later, his name still chills those who read of it. Historians note the irony. Louis XV, once called the Beloved, emerged from the ordeal diminished, his reputation scarred by the savage ritual carried out in his name. Damiens' body was destroyed, but the monarchy's body politic was wounded, exposed as reliant on cruelty rather than love. In the end, François Damiens achieved in death what he had failed to do in life. He struck at the heart of kingship itself, not with a knife, but with the spectacle of his suffering etched into the memory of France.